When we talk about sexual morality, we often dive headfirst into today's debates. Identity, consent, autonomy, all that.
Right, the really immediate polarized stuff.
Exactly. But what if the very idea we're debating homosexuality, as in loving, faithful, long-term same-sex relationships, what if that whole concept was just completely invisible to the ancient world?
That's the leap, isn't it? It's sort of essential for this deep dive we're doing, because morality, as we dig into it, it's not fixed, not at all. It shifts, constantly shifting. What's okay in one era becomes, the ultimate taboo in the next. And that historical pendulum, it swings so wide that yesterday's rules get replaced by a new kind of, a new tyranny almost, unexpected.
And our sources today, they are dense. We need to be pretty nimble here. We've got this really forensic theological analysis of the most debated New Testament verses. Then there's this huge cultural history looking at pleasure, power, Rome, Foucault, the work.
And the psychological angle too. Trying to map the trauma of Roman slavery onto, how we understand the mind today.
So our mission, for you listening, is to try and weave these threads together. We want to get a handle on how fluid sexual ethics really are historically.
And understand that silent, awful psychological weight on the people at the bottom in ancient times. The marginalized.
Right. And then bring it forward. What does the sort of recoil from modern ideas of sexual utopia tell us about the new moral pressures we're facing right now?
It's quite a journey. We're going from Paul's letters, Roman slave quarters,
all the way to 20th century French philosophy and today's anxieties. Okay, let's unpack this. What you're going to find, I think, is that for ages, sex wasn't mainly about who you loved.
No.
It was about where you stood, your social rank. It's complex, but I think there are some major aha moments coming, especially when you see how our modern ideas just don't fit that ancient reality.
And what's really fascinating is trying to bridge those gaps. We have what the powerful wrote down.
Sure, the official record.
Then we have scholars debating it all. And then these modern psychological models we can use to infer what it might have felt like for the powerless, the ones who left no record.
So we need to be really critical. Think about the language they used then versus how we talk now. Stop projecting our 21st century boxes onto people from 2,000 years ago.
Exactly. Context is everything here.
Okay, let's start with that foundation for so much modern debate. Scripture. The core argument in our sources here is, it's simple, but pretty disruptive.
It really is.
The ancient Greco-Roman world, and specifically the world the New Testament was written in, it just didn't have a concept for what we call homosexuality today. That mutual, loving, faithful, long-term thing between two people of the same sex.
The fact that there wasn't a word for it really matters. It's not just semantics. It reflects that the concept itself wasn't really there in their social understanding.
So when ancient writers did talk about male-male sex, what were they talking about?
Overwhelmingly, it was linked to exploitation. They weren't discussing equal partnerships. They were talking about pederasty, adult men and adolescent boys.
Okay.
Or just straight up abuse, rape, sex involving the people with the least power, slaves, prostitutes, often slave prostitutes.
And importantly, these acts were often done by men who were married, right? Free men who had a primary social role as husband and father to maintain.
Precisely. Which tells you it was often about gratification, dominance, power, not about orientation or identity as we understand it. The gender of the partner could be secondary to the act of control itself.
So the moral condemnation you find in those old texts, it's fundamentally aimed at those specific practices, the violent, exploitative, status-driven stuff.
That's the argument. Practices that today we'd probably categorize as sexual assault, coercion, or exploitation of minors or the vulnerable.
Which forces a really critical question for you listening. If those ancient writers were condemning that kind of exploitative violence, does condemning that automatically mean condemning loving, faithful relationships today? Relationships that just weren't even a category back then.
The source material strongly suggests the Bible is effectively silent on homosexuality as we understand it today as a committed modern identity or relationship model. It just wasn't the topic being addressed.
And that brings us straight into the thick of it. Romans chapter 1, verses 26 and 27. Paul talks about women exchanging natural relations for unnatural ones, and men giving up natural relations with women, consumed with passion for one another.
Yeah, these are probably the most intensely debated verses on the topic. And the complexity is figuring out, who exactly is Paul condemning here? What's the scope?
Let's break down one side. We have scholar Jonathan Talon, who argues Paul is targeting someone specific. He says chapter 1 is clearly aimed at pagans or Gentiles, not Jews, not universally.
Right.
What's his evidence for that focus?
Talon points right to verse 23, Romans 1.23. Paul slams those who exchange the glory of the immortal God for images resembling mortal man or birds or animals or reptiles.
Actual idolatry.
Yeah.
Making statues and worshiping them.
Exactly. Overt physical idolatry. And that's something you could really only accuse pagans of, not first-century Jews who were fiercely monotheistic.
Okay.
So Talon argues, since idolatry is the root sin Paul identifies for the Gentiles' moral decline, the other things listed afterwards, including the sexual condemnations in 26 and 27, are specific examples of God's judgment on that specific group, first-century pagans, because of that specific sin, idolatry.
And then, if that reading holds, Paul shifts focus in chapter 2. He starts talking to the Jews about their hypocrisy. So the argument is, the condemnation in chapter 1 is limited. It's about the consequences of Gentile idolatry in that time and place.
That's the core of that interpretation. It puts the passage in a specific historical and religious context. The behaviors Paul lists were, arguably known excesses in the surrounding Greco-Roman culture, seen by Paul as flowing from their polytheism and temple practices.
But hang on, that sounds maybe a bit too neat. If Paul's only talking about first-century Gentiles in chapter 1, doesn't that kind of undermine his larger point later on that everyone is under sin? There's a strong counter-argument for universal application, right?
Absolutely. That's the big challenge to Talon's view. The counter-argument insists Paul's description isn't just historical commentary. It's a description of the universal way divine wrath works against all ungodliness and unrighteousness.
So not limited to one group or era.
Exactly. If you limit the moral decay in chapter 1 to just, say, first-century pagans, you risk weakening Paul's argument in chapter 2 and 3 that everyone, Jew and Gentile alike, is accountable and inexcusable. They see Romans 1 as a foundational statement about the human condition when it turns away from God, not just a critique of papal culture back then.
And this counter-argument also digs into the specific words Paul uses, which I find really interesting. Like in 1.27, when Paul talks about men being consumed with passion for one another, the criticism is he specifically contrasts that with men leaving natural relations with women.
Right.
Why include that comparison if he only meant exploitative acts like pederasty? Wouldn't that comparison suggest something broader is being critiqued?
That's exactly the point they make. The critics argue that reading contrary to nature simply as contrary to convention isn't strong enough. They say the most natural reading points towards something more fundamental, like contrary to the created order, the male-female design.
And the specific Greek word Paul uses for the male partners in 1.27. That's key too, isn't it?
It is. He uses aaron, the general word for male, not a specific word like men or boys that might pinpoint pederasty.
And why is Aaron significant?
Because elsewhere in the New Testament, in really foundational places, like when Jesus talks about creation and marriage in Matthew 19, quoting Genesis.
Male and female, he created them.
Precisely. Or Paul's own statement in Galatians 3.28 about neither Jew nor Greek, male nor female. The word used is aaron in that context of the fundamental creation order.
Okay.
So many scholars argue that Paul's use of aaron in Romans 1 suggests he intended his condemnation to be understood in that broader foundational context, a critique of deviating from the perceived natural created order, not just a condemnation limited to the specific exploitative acts common in his day.
Wow. So, okay, one argument, historical context, specific pagan idolatry leading to specific exploitative acts. The other, linguistic context, universal creation order, critiquing deviation from male-female norms, potentially applying more broadly.
It shows just how layered and sensitive this whole interpretation is. Our sources present both views fairly because, well, the debate is far from settled.
All right, let's step back from the specific scriptural debate for a moment and look at the wider culture. Greece and Rome. We're shifting from theology to social structure here.
And what becomes crystal clear is that for a free Roman man, the primary concern wasn't who he was sleeping with in terms of gender. It was his status compared to his partner.
That idea, gender being secondary to status for a free man, it's really hard for us to wrap our heads around today, isn't it? Orientation feels so central to identity now.
It does. But their whole ethical system was built like a pyramid. Power, control, and how they judged a sexual act depended on basically 4 key things. These really define their moral world.
Okay, what are they?
First, control over desire. Could a free man show mastery over his own appetites? That was crucial.
Self-control. Got it.
Second, the tension between freedom and love, doing what you want, and marital fidelity, which for men often had a lot of wiggle room.
Right. Keep the family line going, but outside of that.
Exactly. Third, the partner status. Was the other person a slave? A prostitute, another free citizen? That mattered hugely.
And fourth,
Fourth, and this is maybe the most alien concept to us, but absolutely defining for them, the active or passive role in the sexual act.
Ah, the active-passive thing. That seems to come up again and again. Why was being the passive partner such a massive deal, such an unpardonable offense for a free Roman man in same-sex relations?
Because it utterly destroyed his status. A free Roman man was defined by being active, politically active, socially active, sexually active, taking the passive receptive role that was seen as profound weakness, effeminacy.
Like imitating a woman, or worse, a slave.
Precisely. It was seen as mimicking the behavior of someone subordinate. It flew in the face of the core Roman ideal of manhood: assertion, dominance, control.
So it wasn't necessarily the homosexual act itself that got condemned among free men?
Not inherently, no. It was adopting the status of the penetrated, the subordinate. The main Roman focus, socially and legally, was all about protecting and ensuring the family order. The spermatic line, legitimacy, ensuring heirs. It wasn't about issuing general blanket prohibitions on all same-sex acts between consenting adults, because that concept barely existed.
And this power dynamic, this obsession with status, it becomes brutally clear when we look at the very bottom of that pyramid. The slave.
Oh, absolutely. Sodomizing your own slave, male or female, was considered so normal, so trivial.
Really? Even harsh moral critics didn't care.
Often they barely mention it. It just wasn't seen as a moral issue worth discussing for the master. Part of the full freedom, the dominium of a master, was the assumed right to use his slave's body sexually, just like he had the power to kill them.
Wow.
The sexual life of the elite back then, at its core, was just a raw exercise in hierarchical power.
Okay, so if ancient sexual morality was all about status, we absolutely have to turn to those who had zero status. The slaves. But this immediately brings up a huge problem, doesn't it? The sources. We're trying to reconstruct the experience of people who were deliberately kept invisible.
That's the fundamental challenge. The overwhelming majority of sources we have, laws, letters, farming manuals, philosophy, faith, they were all written by the slave-owning elite.
Right.
And they operated from a starting point that just fundamentally denied the full humanity of the people they enslaved. So we're always dealing with this inherent top-down bias in the historical record.
Which means, even when Roman writers seem sympathetic, we have to be skeptical. Like Seneca, the Stoic philosopher. He argued the better part of the slave, their mind, could remain free even if their body was owned.
Yeah, on the surface, that sounds enlightened. But our sources urge caution. We have to ask why Seneca might be saying that.
What's the skeptical reading?
Well, many scholars suggest that the Roman elite, living under the increasingly absolute power of the emperors, started feeling a bit, well, enslaved themselves, politically subjugated.
Ah, they saw a parallel. Their own lack of freedom under the emperor mirrored the slave's condition.
Exactly. So seeing the slave's predicament, maybe they used it as a way to argue for their own internal freedom, to say, look, even under tyranny, the noble mind can remain untouched. It becomes a philosophical exercise for their own benefit.
So even the arguments for slave dignity might have been more about the elite's own anxieties than genuine empathy for the enslaved people themselves.
It's a strong possibility. The dominant view remained that slaves endured this extreme form of othering. They were basically categorized as subhuman, creatures who could do human things, mimic human behavior, but weren't granted the actual status of being fully human. Any model of the slave was always filtered through the owner's self-interest. Hashtag 2.2. Psychological universals and the identity crisis.
Okay, so to try and get past this biased record to access the emotional reality, we're looking at modern psychology. The idea being, look, the basic human brain, its wiring, hasn't likely changed that dramatically in 2,000 years. Trauma responses, basic needs, they're probably universal.
That's the premise. It allows us to apply some cross-cultural psychological models carefully to the past. One really powerful one mentioned in the sources is Cutchybush's interpersonal distance model.
Okay, what does that measure?
It looks at well-being based on two universal human needs. The first is agency, basically. Autonomy, having control over your own life. The second is relatedness, social connection, belonging, feeling part of a community.
Agency and relatedness.
Mm-hmm.
So if we plot Roman slaves on those two axes, where do they fall? And what does that tell us about their mental health?
They fall right into the worst possible spot. The model calls it the heteronymous separated axis, meaning they had virtually no agency, their lives were completely controlled by others, and they had very little relatedness, families broken up, torn from their culture, alienated.
Lacking both control and connection.
Exactly. And that position, psychologically, is the absolute least advantageous. It points directly to a massively increased risk for severe mental health problems, chronic PTSD, deep depression, crippling anxiety.
That makes intuitive sense. And this isolation wasn't just like existential, it was practical too, right? The language barrier.
Huge factor. For slaves captured from elsewhere, struggling to learn Latin, that created intense linguistic isolation. We know today how much that worsens mental health issues. It stops you integrating, increases paranoia, helplessness.
And this wasn't accidental. This dehumanization was basically policy for some.
Yeah.
You mentioned the agronomists, the farming writers.
Yeah, writers like Cato, they made the animalization of slaves totally explicit. Their manuals give instructions on managing slaves like livestock, purely about maximizing their work output.
No thought for psychological harm.
Zero. As long as the slave could still perform the basic tasks, even if a slave rose to a position like villicus, the overseer, the underlying assumption was still that they were fundamentally base, untrustworthy by nature, still not fully human.
I need to push back a bit on this universal trauma response. Cultures do process things differently, right? Grief, violence. How can we be so sure a Roman slave felt trauma exactly like we would?
That's a really important distinction. How trauma is expressed, the coping mechanisms people use, how society interprets it, that's definitely shaped by culture. Huge variations there.
Okay.
But what the source material suggests is that the underlying biological response to overwhelming, life-threatening stress and violence, that seems to be hardwired. When your culturally learned defenses just get shattered by a traumatic event.
The fight-or-flight system kicks in.
Right. The physiological response, the neurological impact, hyperarousal dissociation, emotional numbing, that core reaction seems fundamentally similar, whether you're in ancient Rome or modern London. Your body reacts to the threat of annihilation, regardless of the cultural label put on the event itself. Hashtag 2.3, endemic sexual violence and trauma.
And that threat, physical and sexual annihilation, it was just constant and unavoidable part of being a slave in Rome.
Pervasive. The sheer range of sexual abuses is documented everywhere in their stories, their laws, their histories. And what's striking is how little criticism you find from the elite writers themselves.
It was just normal,
Yeah.
baked into the system.
It seems so. Just part of the owner's dominium, their total power.
Let's talk specifics. What did this endemic sexual violence look like?
Well, for female slaves, forced prostitution being made a meretrix was a common way owners made profit directly from their bodies.
Commercial exploitation.
Yeah. But beyond that, some big landowners would actually pair up male and female slaves and then offer the women as, sexual rewards to the men for working hard.
Using women's bodies as productivity incentives.
Essentially, yes. Now, maybe it also increased the number of slave babies, the vernae, but the immediate goal described often seems to be about controlling and motivating the male slaves.
And the trauma for male slaves and boys, just as severe.
Absolutely. Regular rape, sexual abuse, often used simply to degrade and assert control.
There are some infamous examples, right?
Yeah, Emperor Tiberius keeping young boys, he chillingly called them his pisciculi, his little fish for his sexual use. And it went beyond rape. Think about Nero's freedman, Sporos.
Castrated. Forced to live as a woman.
Exactly. Castration was this horrific abuse, unique to male slaves, designed to permanently strip them of their status, their gender identity. Utterly traumatic.
So let's connect this back to that universal trauma idea. Roman culture might have shrugged at pederasty, at least for the adult man involved.
Right, the perpetrator's view.
But the victims, the boys, the girls, the enslaved men and women, they experienced these unwanted acts, these abuses, as traumatic, as life-shattering.
Absolutely. The cultural acceptance by the powerful doesn't erase the victim's biological and psychological reality. Their defenses are overwhelmed. The deep scars, PTSD, anxiety, depression, that would have been a silent epidemic running through the enslaved population. That's the crucial point the sources make. The pain is universal, even if the moral judgment shifts. Hashtag 2.4. Reframing slave suicide and fidelity.
Okay, given that constant threat, that inescapable psychological and physical danger, it's maybe not surprising that slave suicide was common.
It seems to have been quite prevalent, yes.
But the way ancient writers talked about it,
Yeah.
they often didn't see it as desperation, did they? They had a different narrative.
They really did. The standard Roman narrative often, romanticized these acts. If a slave committed suicide or helped their master commit suicide, like Gracchus's slave Philocrates, it was often framed as noble fidelity.
Loyalty, virtue.
Exactly. They were held up as examples of perfect devotion, praised by the elite for their self-sacrifice. Look how loyal my slave was, even unto death.
But if we apply that psychological lens we've been talking about, that narrative of virtue starts to look pretty thin, maybe even like a cover story, or maybe successful brainwashing.
That's precisely the reframing our sources suggest. These accounts might simply be describing people who had been successfully indoctrinated. Their own sense of self, their autonomy had been so completely crushed.
That they internalized the master's view.
Yeah.
Felt indebted.
Yes. Taught to feel this profound debt to the enslaver, creating a psychological trap where the only perceived alternative to serving that master was death itself.
So what looked like a free choice of noble loyalty was actually the ultimate expression of their unfreedom. They weren't choosing virtue. They were choosing the only escape left from a system that had convinced them they had no other identity.
It's a vital reframing. It means those Roman descriptions of slave behavior, especially around loyalty and suicide, they're seriously flawed at best, intentionally false at worst. It's often propaganda reinforcing the power structure.
Which makes sense why we also see the opposite action sometimes.
Exactly. Slaves did run away. They defected during civil wars, like during the Sullan proscriptions, and sometimes they murdered their masters in revenge, like the slaves who killed Minucius Basileus after he had them castrated. Those are acts of ultimate resistance, reclaiming agency against that crushing system.
Okay, we've spent a lot of time establishing that ancient morality was driven by external factors. Status, dominance, the sheer physical power of the owner, the dominus.
Right, external constraints.
Now let's take that understanding of power and constraint and leap forward to the modern age. We're shifting from the tyranny of the Roman slave owner to, well, what our sources call the tyranny of modern permissiveness. How did the promise of total sexual freedom end up creating new kinds of psychological control? Hashtag 3.1, the failure of the sexual revolution.
Well, think about the late 20th century. Michel Foucault nailed it when he described Western society as becoming singularly upfront about sex. We didn't silence it, we did the opposite.
We talked about it constantly.
Endlessly. A superfluity of speeches, narratives, testimonies. One source calls it a generalized discursive erethism, basically, a constant state of sexual chatter, a sexual din.
Right. And all that noise was the soundtrack to the big utopian promise, wasn't it? The sexual revolution.
That was the idea, a clean slate. Create this new man of pleasure, totally freed from old rules, from prudence, just dedicated to infinite gratification.
Driven by thinkers like Wilhelm Reich. That idea that sex is naturally good, only society messes it up.
Yeah, that optimistic view. Remove the repression and harmony will break out. Sexuality is naturally peaceful, just warped by rules.
But it didn't quite work out that way, did it?
The utopian promise kind of fizzled after decades of what one source calls overblown permissiveness, where old rules weren't just broken, they were sort of triumphantly declared dead. Modern society is experiencing this big backlash, a significant cultural recoil.
We're now defenseless before a great moralizing reflex. That's a striking phrase. A moralizing reflux. What does that look like? It's not like old school Puritanism coming back, is it?
No, not exactly. It returns in different forms as a whole set of new disciplinary injunctions, things like intense risk phobia, demands for absolute safety, zero tolerance, and this pervasive search for a frightening kick theorism, a demand for purity.
Purity, not pleasure.
Purity, safety, control. The goal shifts from freedom to the complete elimination of risk and messiness.
And this reaction, this modern craving for purification, our sources see a historical echo there, back to early Christian encretism.
Yeah, it's a fascinating parallel. Encretism comes from the Greek enkreteia, meaning self-control, continence.
Yes.
They were an early Christian movement, pretty extremist, very ascetic, driven by this urgent, apocalyptic feeling the end times are coming. So you had to profoundly mistrust the body, desire its inherent violence, suppress it all.
So the parallel isn't the specific beliefs, but the structure of the reaction.
Exactly. Both are these intense, sometimes extreme reactions against what's perceived as societal chaos and excess, both desperately seeking purity and control in a world that feels dangerous and out of control. Hashtag 3.2, new constraints and performance anxiety.
So the big shift is the old external rules, like from religion, they've faded, but they've been replaced by new internal psychological constraints.
That's the core argument. And the modern obsession with measuring everything, optimizing, competing, the metrics-driven life.
It's extended to sex. to pleasure itself.
Absolutely. We now have the tyranny of performance anxiety in the realm of pleasure. It's not enough just to feel good. You have to perform pleasure optimally.
Which leads to this weird fear. A fear that desire itself is drying up. A drought.
Yeah, this anxiety about the lack of desire, which then, paradoxically, makes everyone focus more on desire, measure it, worry about it, fueling more performance pressure.
It becomes this cycle.
A real bind. Individuals start worrying that desiring their partner too much might somehow lower their own individual sexual performance score. The source calls it a pathetic distress. Maybe it's better to just avoid sex altogether than risk failing at it. Where's the freedom when pleasure itself becomes another test you can fail?
It really is the market logic invading the bedroom. And this new moralizing, this focus on risk and safety, it's showing up in the legal system, too.
Definitely. We see increased judicial repression of sexual violence. Calls for much longer sentences, talk about things like chemical castration in some places. It reflects this societal drive to achieve, quote, a hypothetical 0 degree of risk.
Zero risk. That's the new holy grail, the safe society.
We're demanding the same kind of maximum safety guarantee from the law that we demand from, say, medicine. The individual can't tolerate uncertainty, so society tries to legislate away every potential threat to personal safety and sexual autonomy.
But this push for safety, this secular moralizing, it runs up against another modern force, doesn't it? Economic liberalism, free markets.
Yes, the econometric objection, as the source calls it. This is fascinating. Traditional sexual morality gets opposed not just because it's repressive in a liberation sense, but because it's seen as bad for business, bad for free trade.
How so?
Morality is framed as this fussy, nitpicking code that gets in the way of the free market. Think about trying to regulate the internet to get rid of immoral propaganda or filter content.
The free market purists hate that.
Exactly. It's seen as scandalous interference with the free flow of information, goods, services, and yes, sexual expression, commodified or not. The market fundamentally doesn't care if something is moral. It only cares if it's regulated or taxed. Hashtag tag 3.3, fragmentation and the loss of time.
So these internal pressures, performance anxiety, risk aversion, the loneliness of it all, they aren't happening in a vacuum. They reflect something bigger.
They mirror a broader social fragmentation. The source talks about the desocialization of sexuality, this anxious, lonely pursuit of pleasure, reflecting how work is becoming desocialized, how our institutions are weakening all over the place.
We end up with the individual as king, but a lonely king. What does it mean to say this individual is without a past and without a future?
Without a past means feeling disconnected from those traditional anchors, stable family structures, religious communities, local ties, things that used to give you a solid identity. We're sort of untethered, constantly reinventing ourselves.
Okay, and without a future.
That means lacking a shared collective vision or plan. Those big ideologies of historical progress or revolution, they've faded for many. So the future doesn't feel like a project we're building together. It feels random, enigmatic, indecipherable, just stuff happening.
That randomness, that lack of a map, it's unsettling. And maybe that explains why we cling to the fights we do understand, even if they're kind of over.
That's exactly the point. We're unconsciously shaped by these new constraints, performance, risk, loneliness, but we direct all our energy, our outrage, towards the old ones.
Like fighting traditional morality.
Yeah. We keep battling the old prohibitions because they're familiar targets. They've been desymbolized, they feel safe to attack. We're, as the source says, beating on doors that are already open.
Fighting dead wars.
While the real active constraints, the pressure to perform, the isolation, the fear of any risk those are internalized, we absorb them. They're charged with this powerful, invisible symbolism precisely because they're not explicit rules handed down from on high. They come from within or from the market, making them much harder to even see, let alone resist.
Okay, this is where it gets really, really interesting, I think. We've journeyed from ancient Rome to today, and we've seen how sexual ethics seem constantly tangled up with control, status, power, and fear.
From the Roman freeman, terrified of being passive like a slave.
Right. To the modern individual, terrified of risk, demanding absolute safety in a secular way. What really stands out looking back is that maybe the debate is never really about total freedom versus total repression.
It seems more about which set of rules happens to be in charge at any given time. Are they theological, social, psychological, economic? Which system is currently defining what's moral, what's taboo, what's desirable, what's dangerous?
So if we try to connect all these dots, pull back for the big picture.
Yeah.
What the sources seem to suggest is that maybe the biggest tyranny isn't the explicit rules we fight against.
Maybe it's the moral pressures, the psychological scripts that we internalize, that we act out without even realizing we're being constrained by them.
Which raises that crucial question. When power shifts, from a literal slave owner to an emperor, or from a religious code like Puritanism to the logic of market capitalism, does the actual target remain the same?
It seems the vulnerable human body often remains the main place where ideology gets written, where control is exercised. And it doesn't really matter if that control is wrapped in the language of religious piety or the language of infinite, optimized, risk-free pleasure. The control mechanism just adapts.
So our final thought for you listening, if the whole history of sexuality shows this constant pendulum swing, this struggle between utopian ideals and the inevitable return of new constraints, what new, perhaps unacknowledged moral order are you living under right now? And maybe more pointedly, what old, already demolished fight are you still pouring your energy into?